It was on this lonely stretch of road just outside of Gadsden, Alabama, that postal worker and civil rights martyr William Lewis Moore was assassinated on April 23, 1963. As a child, he was raised by elderly grandparents in rural Mississippi, and he had eventually taken a job in Chattanooga, Tennessee, working for the post office. And so he decided to join the Congress of Racial Equality, and as a solo protest, march 400 miles to the Mississippi governor and deliver to him a letter calling for an end to racial segregation. He had on him a sign that said "End Segregation," and because he was alone, a lot of people thought that he might be an easy target. And a journalist showed up along the stretch of road to interview him as he marched, and it was only about an hour later that he was shot dead on the side of the street. And the reporter who interviewed him broadcast this from a local radio station in Gadsden. In the town of Gadsden, there was a man named Floyd Simpson who owned a store. He heard the radio report and was often seen as a suspect in the case, especially when police showed up at his house and found a .22 caliber rifle that was matched to the bullet that killed William Lewis Moore. However, Floyd Simpson was never taken in and never faced a day of justice. The Alabama governor, Governor Wallace, called it a dastardly act, and JFK even said that it was a cowardly deed only months before he was assassinated in Dallas. But this also demonstrates a pattern of assassinations and violence which would continue for several more years. Violence that was committed by the National States Rights Party. Now, the pattern of violent assassination that I'm referring to happened in July of 1965 when a black man named Willie Brewer was killed in Anniston under very similar circumstances. A white man named Hubert Strange pulled his car up next to Brewer and shot him in the back. Brewer died, but these men were members of the National States Rights Party, a local group which supported Governor Wallace and acted more or less as his bodyguards and thugs to really back him up. And even though Governor Wallace opposed them, none of them ever faced any justice. Now, the man who killed him, Hubert Strange, was released on appeal, and then in November of 1966 was killed in a bar fight. And it's very unusual that the man who killed him, a man named Billy Claude Payton, was arrested in 1969 and sentenced to only 1 year and 1 day in prison. And then he was released, and the issue was dropped. And in the back of this cemetery is the grave of Hubert Strange, an assassin for the National States Rights Party. What's so unusual about his case is that he was the first white man to be sentenced for the murder of a black man in the Deep South by an all-white jury. And a year after the assassination, he had been sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was let out on appeal and was very quickly killed in a bar fight. He's buried here, but there's a little bit more I'd like to mention. If you look at the monument to Hubert Strange's victim at the National Lynching Memorial, you'll see it says he was killed by the Ku Klux Klan. This does two things. One, it makes the Klan look like a more militant organization than it was, and two, it delegitimizes the claim that the National States Rights Party has to being a violent paramilitary that was actively engaged in a string of assassinations across the Deep South. Assassinations that were committed by men like Hubert Strange. And it is very unusual that NSRP activists who are still alive say that many men who were FBI informants were actively involved in their group, and it seems very unusual that men like Hubert Strange were killed in mysterious bar fights almost immediately after being let out on appeal. So naturally, a lot of these killings, I feel, had some level of involvement by federal authorities, and this was very quickly covered up by a string of bar fights and killings, and the leaders of the NSRP, by and large, got off and lived into their old age. Now, something that's worth mentioning, but still difficult to discuss because it seems to absolve the Klan or the NSRP of many of their responsibilities for these murders, is the fact that they had FBI informants within their groups that were responsible for a lot of these assassinations. In fact, the FBI informant that was with the Klan had killed Viola Luzo, and there's some speculation that he might have actually been involved with creating the bomb that killed those 4 little girls in Birmingham. So these FBI informants were going around and killing civil rights protesters and then not testifying at the trials of the Klansmen who were in the cars with them. This could qualify in some sense as basically the government assassinating civil rights protesters, or at least government informants, something which the government covered up, which in this case might have actually happened, because very clearly, even though Governor Wallace opposed this act, the men responsible were never brought to justice.